So thanks. So those were great talks. And let me just kick things off by asking some questions. And maybe I'd love to hear some from the group also. And please feel free to ask me any also. Let me start with you, Justin. It was a great talk.
Thanks.
One of the places that you started was, wouldn't it be cool to have a smartphone app that would be able to do this? What do you see as some of the barriers, and how do you feel about a smartphone app? I get asked that frequently, the question of, well, hey, there's FDA clearance for physicians, but who's to stop somebody from creating a smart app that does knee MRI or brain MR or dermatology? And so where do you think that's going to go in the short term, and what do you think are the pros and cons, and do you have any patients who are actually walking around with their own apps, because there's plenty that are out there?
Yep. That's a great question. So maybe I'll start with when it's still the Wild West, but let's talk about when things were even more Wild Westy a few years back. There's this proliferation of apps out there, Melanoma Finder, Mole Mapper, all these apps that people would publish based on, if you look at what they're basing it on, not so robust data. And actually the FCC cracked down on them and saying, hey, boy, you guys are making claims that you can't support, pull them off the market. And so that's great. I have that very, very same concern as a clinician. I'm conservative by nature, and I can see so many bad things happening if we don't deploy this stuff right? So it's not good enough just to have good technology. You've really got to think so carefully about how do you deploy it, what is the mechanism, and what is the structure? Because if you don't do it right, people get hurt. So we're not talking about, we're talking about cancer stuff here, right? Melanoma is a life and death disease. If your app says, hey, it's safe, and that person takes that as reassurance and doesn't go in, if you miss a melanoma, that's a really bad thing. So I think that's why, I know there's a lot of thought going on at the FDA thinking about how do we think about algorithms and how do we think about this new digital health landscape, and I know they're being open to different approaches about how do you evaluate things. I think that, for one, is the barrier, and I think the data has to be good enough to get clearance for your device, I think, first and foremost. And I think I don't think it would be reasonable to even put it out there in testing, because I know there's some papers that are coming out that have links to, hey, this is our device, or this is our app. Please try it out. Even that I'm really hesitant about, because you haven't given people sort of the boundaries. People don't understand, what can this do, what can't this do, how should I use it, how should I not use this? I think anytime you release something, you can't take it back, right? And so none of my patients currently have this, although many, many ask for it. And I think ultimately that's probably the model that we would want to have. I don't think you would want to have an untethered person out there with this. Maybe eventually, maybe if we had some bigger infrastructure available, but I would always want that person to be tethered into the system, either through their specialist or their primary care provider, who, if you're someone at risk, hey, you get this app, I'm going to prescribe it for you, right? I'm going to prescribe it for you. When you use it, that data comes somewhere. It doesn't just go off into midair. Do I show you the classification? Do you get that output, or does a clinician get the output? Those are all really relevant, interesting questions that remain to be seen, and I'm sure people are going to have different opinions, but I think we owe it to our patients to do something, first and foremost, that's safe, and secondly, that's effective, right? So that's a pretty high bar, and I throw those things out there as sort of provocative statements. It's not ready for that, and I don't think it'll be ready for that for quite a bit of time. And I always talk about how we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. But ideally, one day, would that be great? Yes, that would be wonderful.
Great, thanks. Jeannie, I had a question for you. Also, actually a couple, but let me start out with one. You mentioned that in your data set that you only had 70 patients, but it looked like there's some really cool results. If I'm doing a power analysis and I want to essentially do a study, and I'm going to talk with my statistician before I do it, I can say, how many patients do I need for my study in order to be able to get a certain level, confidence interval, if I'm trying to reject a null hypothesis. And that's kind of what most of us have grown up with. But for machine learning, there doesn't seem to be any way to be able to know that. So when you say more than 70, how much better would 140 be? Or how much better would 700 or 7,000? or 7 million, how do you know for techniques such as what you were describing, which there's a relatively few people that are employing that. It's a really creative technique, and I'd love to see more on that, but there are lots of different techniques you could have used. How do you know, number one, what is the right number, and number two, how do you know another technique might not have worked better, and how does one select a particular technique for a challenge such as that?
That's a really good question. I think that it's, rather than trying to speculate if it's 70 or 700 or 7 million, I think the real proof of the technique would be if you do a prospective study and you actually, for patients that come in the clinic, if you're able to run this, predict 3 years. And then 3 years later, you follow them up, you see what happens to them. And if you have enough patients in your study, then you can revise the algorithm and make it better and better. And that's really the proof of it, right? That's really the real life simulation of how this would be used. And like we sort of heard in the other talk, this is a very specific, controlled sort of task. And these are the results that the computer achieved in that scenario. But yeah, we really need to try it on real patients in a real clinical trial kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenges in healthcare data, we hear a lot about like convolutional neural networks, deep learning, and I work in this area. And one of the big challenges is that you need millions and millions and millions of data sets to train those to be robust. You know, to train a deep neural network, you need a lot of data, even to train one layer of a neural network. And deep is like multiple of those layers combined. And for healthcare, that's tough because a lot of that data isn't necessarily available at your fingertips. B, there are privacy issues of getting those kinds of databases. And C, it's just a lot of data and processing time for images. And so I think it's cool to have techniques like the one I worked on, but other techniques that can actually learn a model on fewer data sets. I think that's an interesting machine learning challenge on healthcare data in particular. But the other sort of thing that gives you confidence is that for sort of a lot of studies, we always focus on the p-value, right? And the p-value is less than 0.05. It's significant. But really the interpretation of the p-value is that you have two means, and are the means statistically different? You have like two Gaussian distributions, and they might overlap. And are the means like different enough? But that doesn't suggest that you can predict or classify based off of that. So classification might be 50% because the means are like that close. But they're statistically different. But the cool thing about machine learning is that when you have classification, you are actually saying that this difference or this result is sensitive and specific enough that you can use it to predict with X number of accuracy, you know, to differentiate and discriminate patients. And I think that's a kind of a new way of thinking in medicine that a lot of, you know, trainees and are, you know, going through school today don't receive a lot of training in.
Great, thanks. I just had a question for both of you, and then I'm going to kind of turn it over to any questions that people have out there. And that is, you know, I have run a number of different conferences in machine learning myself. I have been the person who ran a conference called SPIE Medical Imaging, and I've seen literally thousands of papers and presentations. And every time I hear something like Justin's presentation or yours, Jeannie, I'm thinking, why don't I have that? Mm-hmm. And this is really cool. I'm going to see him next year, and Justin's going to tell me he's essentially gotten a larger database, and he's even more accurate now than he was last year. And I'm going to say, hey, that's really cool, but like, why can't I have that? I'm not using that in my practice today. And you know, I see NE-MR studies frequently and review them. I don't have your software. How does one take what you guys have done and turn it into something that is actually being used in real clinical practice? Justin, you want to go first?
Yeah, so that's where the rubber meets the road. So you know, scientists.
Are you guys thinking of commercializing what you're doing?
So, yeah, so we've been through the process of thinking through it, and I'll share some of what we came to realize. So science is hard, but it turns out that actually even once you have the science, getting it to the patient is even harder. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what we realized in saying, hey, this is a really cool thing that we can do. Even if it's that very little thing, you can have an impact. Where you can give this to primary care physicians. They can decide what patients go to the specialist versus not. that would be cool. You could save millions of visits that way, I'm sure. But then when you start to get into that realm, you come up against two things. One is the FDA. So how do you actually get clearance for a device like yours, especially at a time when they're figuring out, how do they approach this? If you go into the traditional risk categorizations and this is a class 2 or class 3 device, you're looking at many years, big prospective studies, very expensive. How are you going to pay for it? The second issue you come up with is if you're going to commercialize it, what's your business model? Our healthcare system is so fragmented and so frustrating to find the channel where the person getting the benefit is the payer, right? And because of that, there's actually not a huge, we looked at this every single which way with many, many people who do this for a living. There's not a very clear business model for this. There's a kind of a small business model, but not enough to sort of say, we're gonna invest 3 years and much of the waking hours of our lives and millions of dollars to conducting a prospective clinical study so that this can exist on every Epic dashboard and right, so that everybody can be using it. That's actually where the roadblocks have been, and that's really frustrating for me. So right now, it's almost that the pathway that would get this into people's hands is, let's do this, let's validate it, and then let's just give it away, right? Let's just give it away, but having institutions use it in a way that's sort of right and right for their patients. Would love any thoughts or any ideas where anybody's ever encountered similar issues.
Thanks. I'm going to go to the audience, but Jeannie, are you planning on giving yours away also? And, and are you commercializing just maybe in a half a minute or so? And then let me go ahead and see if there's questions.
Well, we're planning on making the software open source.
Okay.
Because it's really a tool that can be used on any kind of problem, on any modality of imaging. So I think what we need is a community of researchers just to try these different applications out. Yeah, I think that's what I would add to that.
Thanks. Questions for any of the three of us? Yeah.
So just to carry on that particular line of questioning, one of the problems I've seen with democratization of that kind of software and devices is that our healthcare data is not structured the same everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And because there's radiology is probably the farthest with DICOM standards, but outside of that, there's almost no standard.
Well, also in radiology, it's a Wild West. In other words, at least we have a DICOM standard once you've acquired it. But what were the sequences that were used for Jeannie's study? Was it T1, T2? Was it echoplanar? Was it diffusion weighted imaging? Was it gradient echo? There are so many possibilities. And then, did she do it on a 1.5 Tesla or 3? She was talking about a 7 and an 11 Tesla system. And so those are completely different potentially. And how much does it generalize? So even in radiology with DICOM, we're still in the Wild West.
But it's farther than other areas. And
I
what
agree,
I was going to say is, roughly 50% of major centers are on Epic, but Epic systems can't necessarily talk to each other for most of the data. So is there, have you thought about ways to break that, what I perceive as a really significant problem for applying this kind of technology in a more democratic way?
Short answer, no. That's exactly what we hit head on, and haven't figured out a way to break through that. So that is fundamentally an issue where the data is siloed. Even in our own institution, pulling data out of Epic for research purposes, like I said, it's harder than doing the science, that's so frustrating that it's there, right? And then we have lots of big institutions, I would imagine, with repositories, and how do you actually then make that more facile? How do you allow sort of the benefits of that aggregate data and that very robustly, richly annotated data to help? And I have no idea.
But that's a great question and comment also, and appreciate that. And I think that is one other additional major barrier. Other questions? Yeah. Sure.
Thank you. Those were great. Thank you, you guys. Justin, my question's more for you. In image visualization, I know there's a lot of normalization that needs to be done, and as you were saying, look at the image, different lighting, all those different aspects that play a role. I guess my question is, in the interest of precision health and medicine for all, have you been able to test and train across ethnicities, or is there any way that this, you've been able to see at least some sort of similar performance across ethnicity?
That's a really good question.
Or in addition to that, is it possible that some of the great success that you had
Yes.
was that your data were biased in such a way that it was from a particular sample population that your AI algorithm learned really well, but a general dermatologist might not know that, but even though you picked a subset to train, the whole data set had a particular bias in a particular ethnicity or area, for example.
Absolutely, and that's sort of the thing that keeps people up at night about this stuff, is you don't know what your network learned, right? Did it learn something inherent about, there's some inherent bias that even if you think really hard about how do we eliminate all that stuff, was it learning something that was different than what you wanted it to learn, and how applicable is it to that patient who comes in who has, dark skin type, right? Are you going to use it on that? Are you going to trust it? Are you going to believe it? Do you have to use a different system? Do you have to modify it? That context that I was talking about makes so much difference in the scenarios like that, that is something that we had no idea about because we actually don't have the metadata for where did that lesion come from on that person, right? So if we do it prospectively, we do it in the clinical setting, that's the real robust way to be able to answer that question. And we may find that, boy, are the differences so vast between different ethnic groups or different X versus Y that actually one system can't do it all, right? Or that you have to have enough data from all of those different subsets to make it robust enough.
Thanks. Do we have time for some more questions or one more question? Yes.
I was just interested in I thought the transport space morphometry approach was really nice because you can actually see where the parameters are coming from for the subsequent classification. But there's also going to be intrinsic biases there, I think, in terms of the data set that you used in the first place for training. I'm talking about QC and what sort of QC you did. And maybe it's a bit too technical a question, but what type of quality controls you did for the imaging that you actually...
And that was a well-known public database.
Right.
The Osteoarthritis Initiative was funded by NIH, and so they have specific funding where they gave scanners and specific parameters to a group of institutions, including our own at University of Maryland, to do the scanning in a very controlled fashion. But let me let you answer that in more detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the quality control measures is that it is from the Osteoarthritis Initiative, and it sort of had to meet their specifications. And then, of course, these were T2 maps, for anyone who's curious, and we standardized them in the same way, using that sort of mapping the curved shape of the condyle to the flat plane. But I think, what it comes down to is that you can achieve these kinds of results, in retrospective fashion on these data, but really, I think a prospective trial would really give you sort of like, the proof is in the pudding, right? When you actually try it out. And you're right that some of these methods might be subject to intrinsic biases in that data set. Maybe if you did it on another set of 70 subjects, you might find slightly different changes that it's picking up on, but that's just something that you would have to try on a larger population and maybe in real life. But I think that one thing that is cool is that this is a little close to real life because these images were collected from this large database and in this heterogeneous fashion, which is, I guess, it's closer to what real life data is going to be like. So I think that's one thing that is an advantage about this rather than a drawback. Great.
Thanks. Thanks for a great session. Thanks for the invitation to participate, and great panel and great presentations too. And thanks so much, and thanks for the great questions too.